I was standing in the hallway of my own home, wearing the blue dress I'd bought 3 weeks earlier, the one my granddaughter said made me look like someone who still had places to be. My hair was done. My earrings were in. I had a car booked for 11:15. And then Clifton grabbed my arm. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at me with that expression he gets, the one I've only seen twice in the 22 years he's worked for me. Once when the pipes burst in the basement, once when my husband collapsed in the garden. That look, that means something is wrong and there is no gentle way to say it. "Don't go out yet," he said very quietly. "Please, come with me." He walked me to the side door of the kitchen, the one that leads to the small covered porch where he sometimes eats his lunch. He pulled it nearly closed behind us and held up one finger. "Wait." I waited. And then I heard my son's voice coming through the screen of the open window above the sink. He was on the phone. He thought the house was empty. He thought I'd already left. I should say something about the day before any of this makes sense. It was a Saturday in late September, the kind of day you only get maybe 4 or 5 times a year in Ontario. The sky, that particular shade of blue that has no name, the maples just beginning to turn, the air cool enough for a jacket but not so cold that you resent it. My youngest son, my daughter-in-law, and their 2 children had driven up from Guelph to celebrate my 63rd birthday. That's what the invitation said. A family lunch. Just us. I had looked forward to it for weeks. I'd made the lemon cake myself, the one my mother used to make, the recipe written in her handwriting on a card I've had since 1987. I'd set the table with the good dishes. I bought a bottle of the Riesling my daughter-in-law likes. My eldest son couldn't make it. He lives out in Victoria now, has for years. And between his work and the cost of flights, it's become something that happens at Christmas and occasionally not even then. That's a grief I've made a kind of peace with. You do what you can. So it was just my younger son. I'll call him my son throughout this, because that's still how I think of him, though there are moments now when I have to remind myself, and his wife and their kids, who are 8 and 5, and who I love in the way you love your grandchildren, which is to say, with a ferocity that surprises you sometimes in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. Clifton had been with me since the year after my husband died. He came through a referral from a neighbor, initially just to drive me to appointments during a period when I wasn't supposed to be behind the wheel after a minor procedure. He stayed because he was steady and honest, and because after Raymond died, the house felt very large and it helped to have someone around who knew where things were. He does not live here. He has his own home, his own life, a daughter in Mississauga he talks about with the particular pride of a father who didn't always get it right but tried hard enough that she turned out well anyway. He comes 3 days a week. He drives me places. He fixes things that are slightly too complicated for YouTube tutorials. He has been, for longer than I sometimes acknowledge out loud, one of my closest friends. I pay him well. He has never once made me feel like that was the whole of what we were to each other. I want you to understand who Clifton is before I tell you what he did for me that day. Because what he did required something beyond loyalty. It required a kind of moral clarity that I think a lot of people talk about, and very few actually possess when the moment arrives. My son and his wife had arrived at 10:30. The plan was to have the kids run around in the backyard for a bit, then sit down to eat around noon. Clifton had offered to come in on what would normally be his day off, just to help with the car. I'd asked him to pick up some things from the bakery that morning. He was supposed to leave by 11. He was in the kitchen rinsing his coffee cup when my son apparently forgot he was there, or assumed he'd already gone. I was upstairs doing my lipstick when I heard Clifton on the stairs moving quickly, which is not how Clifton moves. That's when he came to get me. And now I was standing on the porch in my good dress with my birthday earrings in, listening to my son's voice through an open window. He was talking to someone, his brother I found out later, the one in Victoria. She won't do it voluntarily, my son was saying. That's the thing, she's stubborn about it. You know how she is. A pause. He was listening to something I couldn't hear. The house alone is. I mean, you'd know better than me, but the area's gone up. And there's the investment account. and the TFSA and whatever's still in the business account from when she sold the practice. It's not nothing. It's really not nothing. I stopped breathing. That is not a figure of speech. I genuinely forgot to breathe for what felt like a long time. Suzanne thinks if we can get her to agree to a POA now, while she's still capable, then we have something to work with. A real POA, not just the one she did with the lawyer years ago, the one where everything's locked up and divided and you basically can't touch it without her signature and a full committee. A new one. Suzanne is my daughter-in-law. I have always liked her. I had wine in the refrigerator specifically because I know she likes that particular Riesling. I had driven to 3 different stores to find it. She had that thing with her knee in the spring. And before that, the thyroid stuff. I'm not saying anything's wrong. I'm just saying this is the time to have the conversation, not when it's a crisis. I looked at Clifton. He was looking at the floor. He knew. He'd been standing at that window for at least a minute before he came to get me. My son kept talking. I love her, obviously. This isn't about anything except being practical. Dad didn't have a plan and it cost us 2 years of estate mess. I'm trying to be smart. I'm trying to make sure things go the right way. And then he said, quite clearly, Suzanne thinks she'd respond better if it came from me without you there. Like a one-on-one conversation. Today, probably. While she's in a good mood. Birthday, everyone's happy. It's as good a time as ever. I had to put my hand against the wall. Not because I was going to fall. I wasn't. But because I needed to feel something solid and real. Because the ground had just dropped about 6 inches beneath me in a way that had nothing to do with my knee or my thyroid or anything else my son had apparently been cataloging. Clifton turned to look at me then. Very quietly he said, "You don't have to go back in there right now." I said, "Yes, I do. I want to be fair about this, and I've spent a lot of time since that day trying to be fair. My son is not a bad person. I have known him for 31 years, since the moment they put him in my arms in a hospital room, and he looked up at me with Raymond's exact eyes, and he is not a bad person. But I think he had spent enough time listening to his wife that he'd started to hear her version of our family as the true one, and her version, I've come to understand, has always been a version where I am the difficult variable, the one who complicates things. The one who has too much and holds onto it too carefully and doesn't understand how the world works anymore. I think she had been patient about this for a while and the patience had run out. I'm not certain when it started. Maybe when we restructured the account after Raymond died and I kept full control rather than folding my son in as a co-signatory the way he'd mentioned, very casually, very once, over dinner in 2019. Maybe when I sold my physiotherapy practice in 2021 and didn't invest the proceeds in the way he'd suggested, which involved a company his brother-in-law had a stake in. Maybe it's just about the house that Raymond and I bought in 1989 for $240,000, and that is now worth something I still find bewildering when I look up the neighborhood. I don't know. I try not to make it a calculation. What I do know is that I went back into that kitchen and I smiled when my son came around the corner, and I told him the lemon cake was ready and could he please bring the kids in from the yard. And I watched his face, which showed nothing, no sign of what I'd just heard, which is either a testament to how much he's grown into himself or a testament to something else entirely. I'm still not sure. We ate lunch. The kids were wonderful, the way kids are when they're not aware that the adults around them are conducting something far more complicated than a birthday meal. My granddaughter ate 3 pieces of cake. My grandson fell asleep on the sofa under Raymond's old blue throw, one arm hanging off the cushion. And after the kids were settled and my daughter-in-law was in the kitchen with a second glass of wine, my son sat down next to me on the porch and said he wanted to talk about something. I said, "I know." He stopped. Just for a moment his face changed and I could see him rearranging things internally, deciding which path to take. He chose the direct one. I think that might be the thing I actually respect about him, when I'm being honest. "Suzanne thinks we should talk about the POA situation," he said. "Well, things are good. Well, you're healthy." "Your father and I set up that arrangement for a reason," I said. It was done carefully, with a lawyer. And no, her name is not Patricia, before anyone asks, and it reflects exactly how I want things handled. He looked surprised by that last part. I let him be surprised. I understand that, he said, but that was years ago and a lot has changed. What's changed, I said, is the value of the house. He was quiet for longer than was comfortable. I didn't tell him I'd heard the call. I want to be clear about that. I made a decision standing on that porch in my good dress that I was not going to perform a scene. I was not going to cry or accuse or ask him how he could do this to me on my birthday, the birthday where I made the lemon cake with my mother's recipe. I was not going to be the version of a 63-year-old woman that gets dismissed as too emotional to manage her own affairs. I was going to be boring and practical and completely immovable. My arrangements are not something I'm willing to revisit right now, I told him. If that changes, I'll initiate the conversation, and when I do, I'll have my own legal advice, which I will pay for out of my own accounts, and the outcome will reflect my wishes and not anyone else's. He started to say something. I raised one hand just slightly. He stopped. I'd like to enjoy what's left of my birthday, I said, and I'd very much like to watch my grandson sleep on that sofa for another 20 minutes, because I don't get to do that very often and I find it restorative. We can talk again when there's something new to talk about. He nodded. He went back inside. I sat on that porch for a while longer by myself and looked at the maples, which were very beautiful, and thought about Raymond, which I do every day, but especially on days like this one. When the kids woke up and they were getting their things together to leave, my daughter-in-law hugged me and said it had been a lovely afternoon and that the cake was incredible. She was warm about it, genuinely warm. And I thought, maybe she doesn't know that I know. Or maybe she's better at this than I gave her credit for. Or maybe she herself has told herself a story where what they were planning wasn't really what it was. I don't know. I stopped trying to understand the interior of Suzanne's logic. I found it was costing me things I couldn't afford to spend. After they left, Clifton and I sat in the kitchen for a while. I made tea. He didn't say anything for a bit, neither did I, and that was the right thing, I think. When you've been through something together, you don't always need to process it immediately out loud. Eventually, he said, I wasn't sure if I should come get you. You did the right thing, I said. I thought about just leaving, he said, pretending I hadn't heard it. I know, I said, but you didn't. He was quiet again. Then, what are you going to do? And that was the question, wasn't it? Here's what I did. I want to tell you this, not because I want to present myself as someone who had it all figured out, because I didn't. I went upstairs that night and I sat on the edge of the bed on Raymond's side. I still sleep on my side. I've never moved to the middle, and I held the phone in my hands for a long time without doing anything. I thought about calling my eldest son in Victoria. I thought about calling my sister in New Brunswick. I thought about calling no one and just going to sleep and seeing how I felt in the morning. I called my solicitor. She has a different name, as I mentioned, and she has managed our family's legal affairs since 2003. And when I explained the situation to her, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "All right, let's make sure everything is exactly as airtight as it should be." Over the following 3 weeks, I reviewed and updated every document I had. The existing POA was already structured well, but we added clarity in several places and changed one of the substitute decision makers. I reviewed the will. I reviewed the trust structure that Raymond and I had set up, which protects the house and the main investment accounts from being dealt with outside of very specific circumstances. I also set aside a separate arrangement for Clifton. Not a large sum, nothing that would embarrass either of us, but something that acknowledged 22 years of showing up and being the person in my life who, when it mattered most, came upstairs and got me. He doesn't know the full details yet. He will when the time comes. And then I called my son. I didn't tell him what I'd heard. I'm still not sure whether I will, ever. What I told him was that I'd done a full review of my affairs and felt very good about where everything stood, and that I wanted him to know the arrangements were sound and that if anything happened to me, the process would be straightforward and fair. I told him I loved him. I told him I'd noticed the kids growing and that his daughter was starting to look the way he looked at her age, around the eyes. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mum, I'm sorry about how the birthday conversation went." I said, "I know." He said, I think sometimes I get worried and I don't handle it well." I said, "You can be worried, that's allowed. But there's a way to have that conversation and a way not to, and the way it happened wasn't the right way. If you want to talk about any of this, really talk about it, I'm here for that. I just need it to be honest." He said he understood. Whether he meant it, whether Suzanne gave him room to mean it, I genuinely don't know. We've spoken a few times since. It's careful, the way it is after something shifts. Not cold, but careful. My granddaughter called me on a Thursday 2 weeks later, on her own, from her mother's phone, to tell me about a project she'd done at school about beavers. She talked for 11 minutes. I have the call log. I've looked at it more than once. That's the part I hold on to when I'm being honest about how I actually feel about all of this. Not the documents, not the legal strategy, not even the particular satisfaction of knowing that everything is exactly where I want it, exactly as protected as it should be. It's the 11 minutes about beavers, and the voice that sounds like her father's voice when he was small, and the fact that that part of my family, the part that doesn't know yet what the adults do to each other sometimes, is still, for now, whole. Clifton came in on Tuesday last week. I had made scones, which I do maybe twice a year when the mood takes me. He sat at the kitchen table and ate 2 of them and said they were the best he'd had, and I said I seriously doubted that, but thank you. Before he left, I told him I'd updated the arrangements. I didn't say more than that. He nodded in a way that said he understood what I meant without needing the details. "You know," he said at the door, "you could have just had a nice birthday." I laughed. I actually laughed. "Next year," I said. He said, "I'll hold you to that." And that was that. That's the whole of it. Or the whole of it that I know how to tell right now. There are still things I'm working out. There's still nights when I sit on Raymond's side of the bed and feel the particular weight of being the last one standing in a family that used to be larger. And I think about what it means to love people who disappoint you and to go on doing it anyway, because the alternative is a kind of poverty I'm not willing to accept. I don't regret anything I did. I don't regret going back into that kitchen and making my face do the right things for the rest of the afternoon. I don't regret the phone call to my solicitor or the Tuesday mornings with Clifton and his very honest opinions about my baked goods, or the decision to keep the door open with my son even when I'm not entirely sure what's on the other side of it. What I know, what I am certain of, the way you become certain of things when you've lived long enough to watch your certainties change and then solidify again, is that no one gets to decide what happens to the life Raymond and I built together. Not out of greed. Not out of impatience, not because they've been waiting, however quietly, for the part where I stop being in the way. I'm still here, I still have places to be. And the lemon cake, for what it's worth, was excellent. I've thought a lot about what Clifton could have done differently that morning. He could have finished rinsing his cup and walked out the side door without a word. He could have told himself it wasn't his place. And honestly, by most people's measure, it wasn't. He was there to drive me to the bakery. That was the whole of his job description that day. But Clifton has something that I think is rarer than most people admit. He knows the difference between what's convenient and what's right, and he doesn't pretend those 2 things are the same. That's not a small thing. That's actually the whole thing when you get down to it. What my son did, what he and his wife were planning, came from a place I understand even when I don't excuse it. Fear about the future, impatience, a belief that they were being practical when really they were being premature. I don't think he woke up that morning wanting to hurt me. I think he'd been listening to one version of the story for long enough that it started to feel like the only version. That's a failure of something, of honesty, of the willingness to sit with discomfort rather than reach for a solution that benefits you most. He had the intelligence to see the situation clearly. He just chose not to use it that way. That's the part that still stays with me. And I think about what I did in that kitchen afterward. The way I made my face do the right things. Served the cake, watched my grandson fall asleep on the sofa. There's a version of that afternoon where I fall apart, where I make it a scene, where I let them see exactly what I heard and exactly how much it cost me. I chose not to do that. Not out of weakness, out of a very specific kind of strength that I don't think I would have had at 35 or even 50. The strength to hold your ground without needing anyone in the room to know you're holding it. The calls with my solicitor, the updated documents, the quiet arrangement I made for Clifton, none of that was revenge. I want to be clear about that. It was just me deciding, very deliberately, that the life Raymond and I built was going to stay mine to steward, that no one's impatience, however dressed up in practicality, was going to rewrite that. What I know now, sitting on the other side of it, is that how things turn out tends to have a lot to do with what you're actually made of when the moment comes. Clifton showed up. I showed up. My son, in his own way, is still trying to figure out how to. Maybe he will. The door is open. The lemon cake was made with my mother's recipe on a card she wrote in 1987. I've had that card for nearly 40 years. I will keep having it. And that, I think, is the whole story.